At the beginning of the story, in the city of Serang, Indonesia, 1987, there was a new student who had just moved from Bandung, and the student was named Roy. On his first day of school, he brought his favorite dog named Joe. However, it turns out that this makes Roy be the center of attention. After that, Roy also met a beautiful third-grade student named Annie, and it turned out that Roy fell in love at first sight. However, one of the students named Dullo immediately felt angry and jealous of Annie, whom he had always wanted Annie's love, but Annie never responded. Here it is known, Dullo is the son of an official who controls the Serang region. Therefore, he became pretentious and felt powerful at the school. In fact, he also formed a gang called Borsalino. Later in class, Roy makes new friends named Tommy and Andy. Then after school, Roy helps his mother to deliver clothes that have been sewn for her customers. Here it is known that Roy's mother is a famous tailor in Bandung, but for some reason, Roy and his mother had to move to Serang City. Meanwhile, Roy's father was a famous writer and activist in Bandung, but unfortunately, his father died when Roy was a child. As a result, his mother decided to become a tailor so that she could support them. After that, Roy was told by his mother to deliver orders for clothes that had been sewn to her customers. Elsewhere, Dullo was watching Annie from a distance, and even there he also intended to express his love. But suddenly, he cancelled his intention, because he saw Roy coming to Annie's house to deliver the clothes that had been sewn by his mother. Hearing that, Annie was a little surprised that they were also introduced to each other because they still didn't know. On the other hand, Dullo, who saw that, of course, felt jealous. In fact, he also got more jealousy when he saw Roy protecting Annie from the rain. As a result, Annie became get-feeling and began to like Roy. The next day, Annie ventured to take Roy for a date to Anyar Beach. Hearing that, Roy happily accepted her invitation because Annie was very beautiful and kind. In fact, Annie is also the daughter of a rich man whose life is certainly different situations with Roy condition right now. After that, they both went to the beach to have fun there. Then Annie asked why Roy could keep a dog, even though he was a Muslim. Hearing that, Roy replied that he always removes the impurity on his body when playing with Joe. Even there, Roy also directly held Annie's hand and taught her how to remove uncleanliness. As a result, they were immediately carried away and kissing there. But suddenly, Dullo and his gang came there and immediately forced Annie to go home immediately. Seeing that, Roy tried to hold back his anger. Meanwhile, Dullo, without further ado, immediately attacked him, so there was a solo versus squad fight begin there. In the middle of the fight, Roy began to be cornered because he was outnumbered. Then Joe, who saw it, of course immediately tried to help Roy, who was his master. But unfortunately, Joe was killed by Dullo, who kept hitting him. Seeing that, Roy immediately cried and felt lost because Joe was his only favorite pet. Since that incident, Roy also decided to get drunk because he wanted to forget his sadness for Joe. In fact, he also intends to take revenge on Dullo by forming a new gang at his school. Then Roy told all his friends not to be afraid of Dullo and his gang. After that, at recess, Roy deflated Dullo's car tires. He did this to provoke Dullo's anger so that he could fight with him again. And it was true, the Dullo was provoked so that the fist fight took place there. It can be seen here that Roy was able to fight them, even though he was alone. However, in the middle of the fight, suddenly the head of the student council named Edie came there to stop and separate them. Then after school, Roy did not go straight home. Instead, he partied with his friends until late night. But because Roy was already drunk, his friends finally took him home. Then his mother, who saw it, could only be saddened by the change in her son, who turned into a naughty boy. The next day, Roy's mother decided to paint the walls of her son's room with the same color as the paint in the house in Bandung before. And she did it so that Roy could be happy and feel at home in his current house like was. Here it is known that Roy actually refused to move to Serang, but for some reason, they were no choice to leave Bandung and move to his mother's hometown, Serang. Then the story moves to Roy and his friends who are being punished by the principal for a previous fight with Dullo. But here Roy fights him, making the principal angry and slapping him. But strangely, Dullo was not punished, because the principal was afraid and respected Dullo's father, who was a ruler in the city of Serang. Then, after finishing the punishment, Annie approached Roy because she wanted to apologize for the incident on the beach that made Roy's dog die. Hearing that, Roy still felt disappointed. In fact, he also blamed Annie because he thought that if Roy did not go to the beach at that time, then Joe would still be alive today. Knowing that Annie still wanted to apologize, but Roy just left, when he saw a new student named Dewey, that Roy tried to flirt with her and wanted to get acquainted with Dewey. However, Dewey ignored him because she was not interested in getting acquainted with Roy. Later that night, Roy accidentally met Dewey again at a nightclub. Then, in his drunken state, Roy tried again to get acquainted with her, but Dewey ignored him again. She also didn't care when Roy fell down the stairs, due to the drunk effect. Suddenly, Edie came there and saw Roy's pathetic condition. Knowing that, he took him home. Then when he got home, his mother was sad and asked Edie to make Roy realize that he was a good boy. After that, his mother, who still felt disappointed, told Roy to sleep outside. Long story short, in the morning his mother splashed water to wake Roy. His mother also expressed her disappointment after seeing Roy's attitude of always coming home with drunk. Then his mother told him that Roy felt comfortable living in Bandung, but unfortunately, they were no choice to move, because his father's family always blamed his mother for his father's death. After that, his mother reminded Roy of his promise to become a famous writer like his father. Hearing that, Roy finally realized and felt guilty to his mother. Then he resumed his writing and fulfilled his promise to his father to become a writer. There he suddenly got the idea to discuss the history of the city of Serang and the performance of the government, in which there was someone in power who could do anything he wanted. After that, Roy began to move to seek information from various lower-class people to be used as sources regarding their responses to government performance. Then he also met an old man who was a former military man, and the old man was named Mr. Ajat. After that, Mr. Ajat told him that since his retirement his life had been ruined. He also felt that the government had abandoned him because his house had been evicted and there was no compensation from the government. Therefore, he was forced to become a pedicab driver while selling calendars in order to support his life. After that, Roy also asked about the history of Serang City and the Anyer Panarukan atrocity tragedy. Then he also asked Mr. Ajat's response regarding the rulers who were arbitrary towards their people. Long story short, Roy had gotten a lot of information and he immediately wrote it into an article. After that, he sent it to the newspaper media, hoping that his work would be printed in the newspaper and read by the government. Day after day, Roy continued to take photos that would later be used as documentation for his writing. But at that moment, Roy met Dewey again, and this is where Roy finally got to know her. In fact, they also looked very familiar because they told their respective life stories. It turned out that Dewey's father had also died, just like Roy. But without them realizing it, Annie saw it, and that of course made Annie jealous. Annie even got more jealous when she saw Roy holding Dewey's hand intimately. A few days passed and Roy's article was printed in the newspaper. Even his work made a big impact on everyone, starting from his friends at school, who became brave to fight Dullo's gang, the Bersolino gang. Not only that, Dullo's parents were also offended by Roy's article, so he ordered the principal to follow up on Roy's actions that had offended him from the writing. Hearing that, the principal was submissive and immediately obeyed. Here Roy learned that Dullo's father was indeed a ruler in Serang City. In fact, he is also famous for being able to pretend to be nice to the small people for his image, when in fact he is a very cruel person. Not only that, he was also a mastermind who had given permission to forcibly evict small people's land to build a hotel and others. Later that morning, Edie scolded Roy for writing an article that offended Dullo's father. Hearing that, Roy even reprimanded Edie by saying that Edie was now not brave enough to face Dullo, who he considered to have power and could do whatever he wanted, until finally Edie came to his senses. However, he did not want Roy and Dullo to experience conflict again. Therefore, Edie told the two of them to resolve this dispute by fighting according to custom, which will be witnessed by the martial arts champions in Serang City, until finally the night arrived. Roy and Dullo will fight sportingly, so that they can accept the results of this fight gracefully. At the beginning of the fight, it looked like Roy was superior to Dullo. However, Dullo began to not accept it and started cheating by taking his friend's mashite to attack Roy. But fortunately, Edie realized that and immediately parried it with his silat style, one of local Indonesian martial art. As a result of this, Dullo was declared disqualified because he had cheated. Hearing that, Dullo immediately left there because he was embarrassed. The next day, Dullo asked his father for help to get rid of Roy, but his father refused because it was none of his business. Knowing that, Dullo immediately went to his friend, who was a gangster, to ask for help in exchange for money. Then the scene moves to Roy, who is attending school. However, one of the beautiful students named Wiwick approached him. In fact, Wiwick immediately declared her love for Roy. Hearing that, Roy immediately rejected Wiwick's love on the grounds that Wiwick was not the criteria for his ideal woman. After that, Roy left the classroom to chase Dewey, who he had previously seen coming out of the teacher's room. Then Dewey told him that she would move to Manado because her mother was transferred to work there. Here Dewey also felt sad because she had started to feel comfortable in Serang City and already had friends. But because she was no choice, she had to move and adapt again in a new place. Hearing that, Roy could only encourage her. In fact, Roy had started to like her. On the other hand, it turned out that Annie and Wiwick were watching them. Even Wiwick suddenly cried because she was hurt that her love had been rejected by Roy. Later at home, Wiwick was still sad. His brother, who already knew everything, was immediately angry and unceremoniously cursed Roy because he was a witch doctor. As a result, Roy immediately felt uneasy and he felt a different sensation. Then there, he also saw many demons, but fortunately, his mother immediately came to calm him down. The next day, Roy's condition looked very pale because he was still affected by the love magic performed by Wiwick's brother Wiwick, until one day Roy was in the school clinic and met Wiwick. Without further ado, Roy immediately fell in love with her. But Wiwick instead used the opportunity to avenge her pain on Roy by rejecting him. And since that incident, the only thing on Roy's mind was Wiwick. In fact, Roy no longer cares about the people around him, and he is like a dazed person. Then Mr. Ajat, who saw Roy's condition, of course felt sorry for him and immediately helped him to take him home. But suddenly, Andy came there and told him that his father was rumored to have died after being shot by a mysterious person. That person really likes to slaughter thugs who have tattoos on their bodies. After that, Andy also said that he would return to Jakarta to see his father's body. But here Roy doesn't care, because he is still under mystical influence, so that it makes Andy leave immediately from there and invites Tony to come to Jakarta with him. As for Roy, he was sent home by Mr. Ajat, and in the evening, they immediately went to the shaman to cure Roy, because Mr. Ajat had realized that Roy was being bewitched by someone, until finally, Roy was cured of the witchcraft. Then, after returning from there, Roy was advised by his mother to always maintain his attitude towards others. In fact, she also told him to apologize to the person he had hurt. Hearing that, Roy immediately fell silent and thought about who the person he had hurt was, because he didn't feel he had done anything wrong. Elsewhere, Andy has arrived at Jakarta, and he is immediately sad when he sees his father's body. Then when he wanted to return to Serang City again, suddenly his mother begged Andy to be able to return home and accept the condition of his mother, who was a prostitute. However, Andy ignored his mother and just left. Here it is known that Andy comes from a messy family, because his father is a thug while his mother is a prostitute. But fortunately, his grandmother in Serang City wants to take care of him until he grows up until now. Long story short, Andy and Tony were back in Serang City. But in the middle of the way, they were suddenly stopped by a group of thugs sent by Dullo. In fact, it turned out that they also knew Andy's family, where come from, and background, so they teased Andy as the son of a prostitute. Hearing this, Andy was of course angry and immediately chased the thugs. Unfortunately, Andy and Tony had an accident, which killed Andy instantly. Meanwhile, Tony broke his leg and had to be amputated. Roy, who got the news, immediately went to the hospital to see Tony. There he felt sorry for not coming with them to Jakarta. Then Roy also found out that the accident must have been caused by Dullo's gang. Therefore, Roy also felt very guilty for not going with him and protecting them. Until finally, Roy was upset again. Then Roy slowly began to make peace with himself and accepting his fate. In fact, he was also determined to fix everything by becoming a better person. Then Roy met Wooick to apologize for his words that had hurt Wooick. After that, he also tried to improve his relationship with Annie and did not blame Annie for the death of his pet Joe. Until finally Roy's relationship with Annie improved, and now they are closer again. Then Roy tries to find the courage to meet Annie's father and win his heart to be allowed to date Annie. But unfortunately, Roy's attempt to win over Annie's father was disrupted by Dullo. Because at that time, Dullo's father got information about Roy from a news article that discussed Serang City while offending him. Then Dullo told his father that Roy was close to Annie. Hearing that, Dullo's father immediately invited Annie's father to meet. As it turned out, they were both comrades in arms when built the city order of Serang. Then Dullo's father told him that Roy's father had challenged and demonstrated with his friends to reject foreign investment in 1974. After explaining everything, Dullo's father told him to keep Annie away from Roy, because it was feared that Roy would become a dissident in the future. As a result of this incident, Annie's father immediately forbade Roy. In fact, he also told what Roy's father had done in the past. Hearing that, Roy denied it, because Roy's father could not have done that. After an argument, Roy finally began to take offense at Annie's father's words. Knowing that, he immediately left there. Meanwhile, Annie herself felt disappointed with her father for offending Roy. Then after returning from there, Roy again got drunk to vent his emotions. But fortunately at that time, Edie tried to calm him down, and he also tried to listen to what had happened with Roy. After that, they met their friend Edie, who worked as a racing motorcycle mechanic, and the two of them were named Momo and Roni. Then Edie explained that they were reliable mechanics who had been trusted. Even and himself once asked them to help him fix his motorcycle. Hearing that, Roy immediately remembered Andy's motorcycle, which was damaged in an accident. The next day, Roy met them while bringing Andy's motorcycle to be repaired, but here Roy said that he didn't have the money to fix it. Hearing that, of course, Momo and Roni were confused, but they both gave Roy a solution to get money very quickly, and it turned out that the solution was illegal racing. Hearing that, Roy immediately accepted it because he likes challenges. Then before that, Momo and Roni taught Roy to race, and after feeling his skills were sufficient, Roy finally began to take up and catch up his new hobby of illegal racing. Every night, Roy turned out to be very good. In fact, he also always won the race. On the other hand, Dullo's men found out about it, and he immediately reported it to Dullo. He reported that Roy had become an unbeatable illegal racer. Knowing that, Dullo felt jealous and rivaled, so he immediately challenged Roy to race on the Pemanyukin track area. Here Roy immediately accepted the challenge because he still held a grudge against Dullo, who had made his two friends harmed. Then Roy learned the track that would be used as a place to race with Dullo. In fact, he also continued to practice using Andy's repaired motorbike. But suddenly Edie came there and tried to make Roy realize that he would not be provoked by Dullo to join the race. Roy denied it because he would continue his training to accept the race challenge from Dullo. Long story short, race day arrived. Then Dullo and Roy were seen competing with each other to get the first position. On the other hand, Edie invited Annie to watch Roy racing wildly. Hearing that, Annie immediately rushed away because she was worried something would happen to Roy. Arriving at the race location, they saw Roy in the leading position, and finally Roy won the race. Not long after, Dullo appeared at high speed and wanted to hit Roy to get hurt. But suddenly he dropped his own bike because he didn't want to hit Annie, who was in front of Roy. Then Roy, who saw this, immediately approached Dullo and beat him up. Dullo's men who saw this did not accept it and immediately pointed a gun at Roy. But suddenly Dullo prevented him. He even admitted his defeat so that the dispute between them ended. Then Roy went to the beach and he immediately remembered all the events he had experienced in Serang City. But suddenly he decided he wanted to travel further so that he could get to know many people and find his true self. Then he asked his mother for permission to leave. Here Roy also promised to return home someday to meet his mother. After that, Roy said goodbye to his friends at school. He also did not forget to say goodbye to Annie. Here Roy says that he promises to keep his heart only for Annie. He also said that someday he would go home and marry Annie. After that, then the story ended.